Okay, now we're going to do prayer in league with omnipotence, which we're going to cover Exodus chapter 8 to 10. So in chapter 8, we go through where the Egyptians worshiped the Nile River like a god, and we can see in the first calamity, which was the first plague, that their river god was discredited when the river turned to blood, which killed the fish. So each of the following calamities further discredited another one of the Egyptian gods. So with the first plague, we discredited the god known as Hapi, who was the god of the Nile. And in verse 2 of chapter 8, where the plague, verse 2 of chapter 8 is, "But if you refuse to let them go, then I will plague all your territory with frogs." So this is Hikit, which is the god of the goddess of the frog goddess. So if you go over to verse 6, when Aaron stretched out his hand over the waters of Egypt, the frogs came up and covered the land of Egypt. But the magicians did the same thing by their occult practices and brought frogs up onto the land of Egypt. So here you can see that the magicians were able to use their occult practices or to duplicate to duplicate the exact same plague. They were only making the problems worse because they could duplicate the problem or move it to elsewhere, but they could not solve the problem. Therefore, they make the problem worse, or just, in shifting the problem elsewhere, like they would do in your life. You think you're solving one thing and, you come in for a pain with your head, they fix the head, but so you think it's fixed, but it's really the pain is then just moved to your knee or elsewhere. Okay, so we go to verse 13. The Lord did as Moses had said. The frogs in the house and sent the frogs in the house, the courtyards, and the fields, and they died. They piled them in countless heaps, and there was a horrible odor in the land. But when Pharaoh saw there was relief, he hardened his heart and would not listen to them, as the Lord had said he would. I think it's key to see that you have to just wait on God's timing for fulfillment of his promises. Just be patient and submissive to him. Now we can move on to verse 16, where you're going to see the third plague take place, which was the plague with the gnats. And here, God tells Moses to tell Aaron to stretch out his staff and strike the dust of the land, and it will become gnats throughout the land of Egypt. All the dust of the land became gnats throughout the land of Egypt, and the magicians tried to produce gnats using their occult practices. However, they could not, and the gnats remained on people and animals. So this is clear here. It shows like this is the finger of God. If you look to verse 19, and the magician said to Pharaoh, but Pharaoh's heart was still hard, and he would not listen to them, as the Lord said he would. Then when you go to verse 20, we move into the fourth plague, where there's the swarm of flies, and the Israelites were spared by this. Now, as we saw with the gnats, the finger of God could not be copied, but you did see the pattern with Pharaoh where he revealed his actions, because when the deck was stacked against him, he would promise just about anything, and he would harden his heart and not follow through with his promise. So even though the magicians tried to duplicate what the finger of God did by putting forth the gnats, their powers just couldn't, and they could no longer duplicate any of Moses's acts. So when we moved to the swarm of the flies in the land of Goshen, where the people were living, there were no flies there. However, if you look at verse 23, I will make a distinction between my people and your people. This sign will take place tomorrow. So on verse 24, and the Lord did this. So thick swarms of flies went to Pharaoh's palace and his officials' houses throughout Egypt. The land was ruined because of the swarm of flies. Then Pharaoh summoned Moses and Aaron and said, go sacrifice to your God within the country. But Moses said, it would not be right to do that, because what we will sacrifice to the Lord our God is detestable to the Egyptians. So then you go down to verse 27. We must go a distance of 3 days into the wilderness and sacrifice to the Lord our God as he instructs us. So Pharaoh responded, I will let you go and sacrifice to the Lord your God in the wilderness, but don't go very far. Make an appeal for me. So as soon as I leave you, Moses said, I will appeal to the Lord, and tomorrow the swarms of flies will depart from Pharaoh, his officials, and his people. But Pharaoh must not act deceptively again, by refusing to let the people go and sacrifice to the Lord. So that brings us into chapter 9, where we see the first 4 plagues were major inconveniences for Pharaoh and the Egyptian people. With the 5th plague, however, they began to experience a more serious economic loss. So in the 5th plague being the death of the livestock, of course, the Israelites were spared. But here in verse 1, it says, "Go into Pharaoh and say to him, 'This is what the Lord, the God of the Hebrews, says. Let my people go so that they may worship me. But if you refuse to let them go and keep holding them, then the Lord's hand will bring a severe plague against your livestock in the fields, the horses, the donkeys, the camels, the herds, and the flocks. But the Lord will make a distinction between the livestock of the Israelites and the livestock of Israel and the livestock of Egypt, so that nothing of all that the Israelites own will die.' And the Lord set a time. The time was tomorrow, and the Lord will do this thing in the land. The Lord did this the next day. So all the Egyptian livestock died, but none among the Israelite livestock died." I think it's very clear from this that the plague against the livestock was to show that because many animals were worshipped by the Egyptians, who had a number of animal-headed gods like bull god, a cow god, a ram god. So all of these gods, through this plague, it just revealed that all of these gods had no power to protect the livestock. Then we go to the 6th plague, which you can see were the boils, which in verse 8, "Then the Lord said to Moses and Aaron, 'Take handfuls of furnace soot,' and Moses it is to throw it toward heaven in the sight of Pharaoh. It will become fine dust over the entire land of Egypt. It will become festering boils on people and animals throughout the land of Egypt, to the point where the boils were even on the magicians." And of course, was able to see that the magicians were also completely powerless. Then we move on to the 7th plague, which was hail, which again the Israelites were spared. So in verse 14, "For this time I am about to send all my plagues against you, your officials, and your people. Then you will know there is no one like me on the whole earth. By now I could have stretched out my hand and struck you and your people with a plague, and you would have been obliterated from the earth. However, I have let you live for this purpose, to show you my power and to make my name known on the whole earth." In some ways, God still does this today because he wants his people to spread his word and give their testimonies for revelations. When other people hear them, they get revelations to know how to fight things, to do things, to move forward, and to abide in God. So his name and his power is known throughout the earth. This is also to show that God could restrain his power, or he could fully show his power. But God is always in complete control of all the nations, the leaders, and everything, just as he's showing here that Pharaoh only had power because God had placed him in that position, and that God deliberately placed Pharaoh there in order for God to make his name known throughout the earth. I think this goes to show that there are areas of everyone's life where they may attempt to bargain with God, but that bargain is a sign of stubbornness and rebellion toward God. So it's important to look at any of the obstacles in your life and just take a look and see what might be holding you back from fully submitting your life to God's will. Anyway, the miracles of Exodus were spread far and wide, and the people of Jericho had heard this story and were frightened of the Israelites because of it. So in verse 18, God rained down the worst hail that had ever occurred in Egypt from that day. So the hail was so severe that any of the people and animal outside were unprotected and would have been killed. So in verse 20, "Those among Pharaoh's officials who feared the word of the Lord made their servants and livestock flee to shelters. But those who didn't take to heart the Lord's word left their servants and livestock in the field." And they were, of course, pummeled by the hail. So if you go down to verse 25, "Throughout the land of Egypt, the hail struck down everything in the field, both animals and people. The hail beat down every plant of the field and shattered every tree in the field. The only place it didn't hail was in the land of Goshen, where the Israelites were." So in verse 27, again, Pharaoh came with his deception to Moses and Aaron, and he says, "I have sinned this time." He said to them, "The Lord is the righteous one, and I and my people are the guilty ones. Make an appeal to the Lord. There has been enough of God's thunder and hail. I will let you go. You don't need to stay any longer." So then in verse 29, Moses leaves, and then he says, when I have left the city, I will spread out my hands to the Lord. The thunder will cease and there will be no more hail, so that you may know the earth belongs to the Lord. But as for you and your officials, I know that you still do not fear the Lord God. So if we go now to chapter 10 of Exodus, we're going to cover the eighth plague, which was the locusts, and the ninth plague, which was darkness, from which, of course, the Israelites were spared from darkness. In chapter 10, in Africa, you know that the locusts still swarm over the land, eating everything in their path. They are carried by the wind coming over the Red Sea. Within a few days, they can devastate an entire country. Anyway, let's go to verse 3 of chapter 10. So Moses and Aaron went into Pharaoh and told him, This is what the Lord, the God of the Hebrews, says. How long will you refuse to humble yourself before me? Let my people go, that they may worship me. But if you refuse to let them go, then tomorrow I will bring locusts into your territory. Of course, we know that Pharaoh's immense pride led to his downfall. Because he considered himself a god. Maybe he just simply thought that if he gave into the one true God, that he himself would be exposed as just a mere human, and he wouldn't be the God that he let everyone believe he is. Anyway, the hail had already damaged the crops in the field, so the locusts would have just devoured the little that was left. So if we jump over to verse 18, then the Lord changed the wind to a strong west wind, and it carried off the locusts and blew them into the Red Sea. What's interesting and clear here is that the east wind brings bad things, darkness, black things, as you can see in verse 13, where God sent the east wind. But then in 18, God sends the west wind, which brings a change from God. So if you jump down to verse 21, then the Lord said to Moses, stretch out your hand toward heaven, and there will be a darkness over the land of Egypt, a darkness that can be felt. So Moses stretched out his hand toward heaven, and there was a thick darkness throughout the land of Egypt for 3 days. One person could not see another, and for 3 days they did not move from where they were. Yet all the Israelites had light where they had lived. See, this is how God makes you a light in a dark place. One of the Egypt's chief gods is Ra, the sun god. So the darkness basically ridiculed this god, revealing that Ra was completely powerless to keeping darkness from covering Egypt for the full 3 days. So God is the only God and creator of the sun, because God, the almighty creator alone, could be the only one that could have brought darkness while still giving sunlight to the Israelites. So again, through Moses, God demonstrated his power.